I am really proud to say that this video is sponsored by Ren. No matter which way we look at it, we're all part of a global community. Our actions affect the world we live in, and climate change is perhaps the greatest challenge that we have ever faced. Everybody's lifestyle emits CO2, but what if you had a better way of minimizing your carbon footprint? Ren is a platform which allows you to make simple but effective changes to make a difference in the climate crisis. Ren allows you to calculate your carbon footprint and then implement a variety of changes to reduce carbon emissions. By answering a few questions, you can determine what your carbon footprint is, and then by signing up for a monthly contribution, Ren will apply your funds to projects like tree planting, mineral weathering, and rainforest protection. They're also involved in other projects, and I've provided a link below to give you a better idea of this. The best part is, you get to see where your money is spent, with photos and details of trees planted, acres reforested, and every ton of carbon offset. Living in the San Francisco Bay Area myself, I can tell you that we fear fire season. Burned landscape is not that far away, so planting a tree is very near and dear to my heart. So hit that link below and begin to offset your carbon footprint on Ren today. The first 100 people to sign up will have an extra 10 trees planted in their name. And now for the video you've been waiting for. The Komnenian Restoration would be the last golden age of the Eastern Roman Empire. It would be followed by the darkest of days. Beginning in 1081, under Alexios I Komnenos, the empire, for the most part, would thrive politically, economically, and militarily. Alexios I, his son John II, and his grandson Manuel I would all enjoy long and relatively stable reigns. But a cornerstone of their prosperity was due to the resurgence of trade, and mark my words, this came at a price. Constantinople had a commanding position on the Bosphorus and was a major hub of commerce. The Italian city-states to the west, which had grown immensely rich on the trading boom, all wanted a part of the cosmopolitan city. Thus, the number of Latins living in the Byzantine capital soared, reaching 60 to 80,000 by the time of Manuel I's reign. Their presence was first resented, then hated, then reviled with a growing vigor. Emperor Manuel I attempted to rein them in, expelling many of the Genoese and Pisan residents. But the Venetians were not so easy to move. They knew how to fight back and had leverage. Now, while the people of the Eastern Roman Empire enjoyed the prosperity of the Komnenian Restoration, because of the perceived Latin favoritism, they really began to dislike their emperor. The fact that Manuel I truly had a love of Western culture appeared, at least on the surface, to protect the Latins, and had a Latin wife, Maria of Antioch, didn't help matters a bit. On September 24, 1180, the emperor died, leaving behind a young son. Maria of Antioch was made the queen regent, but she was nowhere up for the challenge. If anything, she was a scapegoat for the growing hostility that the Eastern Romans felt toward their Latin neighbors. This was a powder keg of Greek fire waiting to explode. The death of the emperor had left an opportunity for ambitious men in the aristocracy to seize. Andronicus I was the cousin of Manuel I. He had ambition. John Julius Norwich explains just how much. Quote, Andronicus had always had his eye on the imperial crown. He learned of the growing dissatisfaction with the empress regent. He needed little persuading that his opportunity had come at last. In August of 1182, he marched on the capital. The army and navy hastened to join him. Even before he crossed the straits, rebellion had broken out in Constantinople, and with it exploded all the city's long pent-up xenophobia. What followed was the massacre of virtually every Latin in the city. women, children, the old and infirmed, even the sick in the hospitals. Andronicus's triumph had brought out a degree of brutality that none had suspected." End quote. Now keep in mind that the majority of those that died were Venetians, something that would not be forgotten. Meanwhile, Andronicus had claimed the throne by appealing to popular support to place the Byzantine first. He did nothing to stop the massacre. The man believed in the enforcement of order. Norwich would say violence and brute force were his only weapons. He did stamp out corruption as never before and ruled with an iron fist, which was at first applauded. But soon he would resort to bizarre forms of punishment and torture to keep his aristocracy in line. There were rumors that he had gone insane. Fear and resentment began to grow, culminating in rebellion. Andronicus, sensing the change in his support, attempted to flee the city, but was caught. In the end, he reaped what he sowed. He himself was tortured for several days. Eventually, he was dragged to the hippodrome where he was hung by his feet and sword bayoneted by 2 Latin soldiers until he bled out. Now, whereas the time of Andronicus I was regarded as a reign of terror, what would come next would be even worse. The man that would come to power, Isaac II, established the Angelus dynasty. As mentioned before, this dynasty was regarded as one of the worst, if not the worst, in Byzantine history. Isaac was a truly inept emperor who would always seem to favor pleasure over ruling an empire. He sold high administrational offices to completely incompetent nobility. The army and the navy were left to languish, becoming dangerously weak in comparison to their neighbors, who were only honing their abilities. The emperor would squander the diminishing income of the empire for lavish gifts and immense building projects, or simply use meager funds to pay off aggressive neighbors with tribute. Although, to his credit, he was able to put down several rebellions, and indeed in 1185 he was able to fend off a Norman invasion, he was, alas, incapable of stopping the fragmentation of his empire. The Bulgarians were able to establish a strong empire in the west, along with the Hungarians and the Serbs. Byzantine supremacy in Eastern Europe would be lost, and it would never return. In the east, the Seljuks remained implacable enemies and would prevent the Eastern Empire from asserting authority in Asia Minor. Even the island of Cyprus during this time would break off. Isaac II Angelus could do little but watch this happen, but the empire would not tolerate him for long. John Phillips, in his book The Fourth Crusade, described what happened next. Quote, "Conspirators plotted to replace Isaac with his brother Alexios Angelos, whom they hoped would be more sympathetic to their wishes. A hunting expedition to Thrace offered the perfect opportunity. On the 8th of April 1185, as the imperial party left the main camp and rode off to hunt, Alexios and his men made their move. Once Isaac was fully engaged in the chase, the conspirators led their man to the imperial tent and acclaimed him emperor. Isaac learned exactly what had happened. He thought to charge back into the camp, but his men were too few to fight effectively, and so he fled. Alexios followed in pursuit, knowing that he had to capture his brother before he got back to Constantinople. Isaac was soon caught and taken to the monastery of Zara in southern Thrace. There, as Nicolle tells us, he endured an excruciating torture. He looked upon the sun for the last time and his eyes were gouged out. The Byzantine judged that blinding rendered an individual unfit to rule. Isaac was then cast into prison. Once enthroned, Alexios III, as he became known, kept Isaac under a relaxed house arrest and extracted a promise from him and his son, Prince Alexios, that they would never conspire against him. Unsurprisingly, that promise was never kept." End quote. Now, while Isaac II was regarded as being a poor emperor, his brother was even worse. Alexios III squandered what was left of the treasury to pay tribute to maintain the peace, but this did very little. The Seljuks would continue to overrun Asia Minor, and the Bulgarians and the Hungarians would continue to overrun the Balkans. The Byzantine army and navy were neglected even more, becoming a shadow of their former selves. Indeed, the once proud Roman fleet was now reduced to a few derelict vessels. Even their anchors went missing, sold off by corrupt officials. But of all the mistakes that Alexios III had made, leaving his brother Isaac and his nephew Prince Alexios alive was perhaps his greatest. As Isaac II languished in his prison in Constantinople, he began to formulate a plan with his son Prince Alexios to help him reclaim the throne. The young prince hired 2 Pisan merchants to help him escape the capital, and then eventually fled to the court of Philip of Swabia, his brother-in-law, who also happened to be the king of Germany. It was here in the autumn of 1202, as the Venetian fleet was making its way towards Zara, that Alexios met Boniface of Montferrat, again the leader of the Fourth Crusade. Alexios learned of the plight of the Crusaders, that is, how much they were in debt to Venice. He came up with an offer that he felt was for their mutual benefit. Geoffrey of Villehardouin recorded its content, quote, "Since you are on the march and in the service of God, and for right and justice, it is your duty to restore their possessions to those who have been wrongfully dispossessed. Prince Alexios will make you the best of terms. First, if God permits you to restore his inheritance to him, he will place his whole empire under the authority of Rome. Second, since he is aware that you have spent all your money and now have nothing, he will give you 200,000 silver marks. Moreover, he himself will go in your company to Egypt with 10,000 men, or if you prefer it, send the same number of men with you. And furthermore, so long as he lives, he will maintain at his own expense 500 knights to keep guard in the land overseas." End quote. By the time this became common knowledge, the Crusaders had laid siege to, taken, and then looted Zara, another Christian city, and as a result, they had been excommunicated by the Pope. As they wintered in Zara from 1202 to 1203, they knew that they were in a desperate situation, not to mention that they still owed the Venetians a considerable amount of money. Alexios' offer divided the Crusaders, and many of them just simply left the pilgrimage altogether, or made their way to the Holy Land on their own. Doge Dandolo and his Venetian contingent were initially very apprehensive, but they saw this as a financial way out of the debacle that they were in and decided to back up the plan. Despite the division in the Crusader ranks, a majority also supported the move on Constantinople. They would eventually get their chance. In February of 1203, Innocent III lifted the excommunication order he had placed on the Fourth Crusade, acknowledging that the rank and file were under a lot of duress. This absolution, however, didn't apply to the Venetians who refused to repent. Thus, for the most part, the Fourth Crusade was once again the warriors of God. Now, it needs to be pointed out that while Innocent didn't directly support the Crusader diversion to Constantinople, he didn't condemn it either. Later historians would criticize this. Some argued that the appeal of putting the Byzantine Empire under papal authority was simply too tempting for Innocent III. But either way, Constantinople was now the next destination. In the spring of 1203, the Venetian fleet underwent refit and prepared to leave. As a farewell and gesture of strength, Zara was razed to the ground. Its fortifications and city walls were dismantled, only the churches were spared. Then on April 7th, the fleet left Zara and headed for Durazzo, which capitulated to the authority of Prince Alexios. This was an encouraging development, but the enthusiasm was not to last. John Phillips explains the situation at their next destination. Quote, "The city of Corfu refused to open its gates, and the inhabitants declared their opposition to Alexios by using catapults to compel the Crusader fleet to withdraw. This antipathy towards the young prince made it clear that he could not count on a friendly welcome throughout the empire, and that loyalty to the existing regime was not as brittle as he would have liked. End quote. The Fourth Crusade made camp just outside of Corfu, where Prince Alexios physically joined them. For a brief time, the Crusaders reorganized. On May 24, 1203, the fleet left Corfu, rounded the tip of Greece, and then made its way across the Aegean. The city of Abydos on the Hellespont surrendered prudently, and then, finally, on June 23, 1203, the Fourth Crusade arrived at Constantinople. The sight, for many, was overwhelming. The magnitude of the grand city and its impressive fortifications was frightening, even to the bravest man. But the people of Constantinople were equally apprehensive. The Venetian fleet was a spectacle to behold. It paraded before them along the Sea of Marmara, before landing and establishing camp on the Asian shore across the Bosphorus. By June 26, the Fourth Crusade was firmly entrenched within view of the city at Chalcedon and Skotarin. Alexios III, who had heard that the fleet was approaching, began preparations for the defense, repairing the city walls, bringing in supplies, and refitting the decrepit fleet. But the emperor's efforts were half-hearted at best. Indeed, crops that were just harvested were left within reach for the Crusaders to simply take. However, Alexios III could still rely on his army, which was formidable, but not quite the well-disciplined force it had been under Manuel I. A delegation was sent in early July offering the Crusaders tribute if they would leave. This was rejected as the Latins insisted that Prince Alexios needed to be restored to the throne. A fight seemed inevitable. Meanwhile, Doge Dandolo came up with a last-ditch plan to avoid confrontation. Prince Alexios was placed on a ship and was sailed near the city on display. There was still some hope that popular support would welcome in the young man and see his uncle usurped. However, the reception that he got was extremely poor, and it began to dawn on the Latins that not only had they put too much faith in the prince, but now they would most likely have to fight their way forward. The Crusader High Command gathered to formulate their plan. The walls of Theodosius II, the legendary triple land walls of Constantinople, were nearly impregnable. The seawall along the north of the city, next to the safe harbor, the Golden Horn, was the weak point. But first they would need access to that body of water, and that was protected by a massive chain that blocked the harbor, of which one end of that massive chain was secured in the city of Galata, just north of the Golden Horn, and thus it would be here that they decided to begin their attack. July 5th, 1203 was a clear, fine morning, ideally suited for one of the greatest amphibious assaults in medieval history. The Crusaders moved into position to land just north of Galata. Alexios III at this point had already deployed his army into position. Crossbowmen and archers were placed on the Venetian galleys and began a shore bombardment of bolts and arrows. Under this cover, the horse ships were brought up. The front doors on the ships were brought down, and knights that were already mounted and in full armor poured out into an awe-inspiring battle formation. The Emperor's men saw exactly what was coming next, a full-on charge, but most didn't wait around to see this happen. They broke and ran for their lives. Alexios III abandoned his position so quickly that he left his tent, pavilion, and a wealth of money behind. His men, at least those that managed to escape, retreated to Galata. That night, the Crusaders brought up reinforcements and camped out near the town. But the next morning, Alexios III had brought in his own reinforcements from Constantinople. At 9 a.m. on the morning of July 6th, the Byzantine counterattacked and surprised their enemies. The Crusaders were initially cut down. But as the battle dragged on, the Emperor's attack began to lose steam. The Imperial forces were then the ones that were forced back, with the Crusaders in hot pursuit. Sensing an opportunity, the Latins pressed the attack. The Byzantine defenders began to fall back in total disarray from this onslaught. Nikitas Koniates would remark, quote, It was a sight to behold, the defenders fleeing after a brief resistance. Some were slain or taken alive, and others slid down the chain as though it were a rope and boarded the Roman triremes, while many others lost their grip and fell headlong into the deep." End quote. Shortly thereafter, the citadel, the Galata Tower, was taken by storm. Resistance collapsed and the city surrendered. The chain that blocked the harbor was then cut, and the Venetian fleet sailed into the Golden Horn. Phillips explains the situation well. Quote, "The Byzantine vessels laid at the Venetians' mercy. The attack galleys hunted down the sorry remains of the Greek fleet, sinking some and capturing others, while a few chose to scuttle their ships rather than be taken. Breaking the chain was a tremendous blow to the Byzantine. Tearing through this vital protective barrier meant the Westerners could now push into the inner waters of the Golden Horn. This in turn allowed them to bring their fleet close up to the walls, dramatically increasing the pressure on the Byzantine." End quote. Even though Galata and the Golden Horn were now secured, the Crusader position was still precarious. The immense city could not be blockaded entirely. The Byzantine army was still formidable. Supplies were running out, and the relatively small Crusader force would not be able to attack anything more than a small portion of the city walls. The Fourth Crusade thus began the next phase of their operations. The next 4 days were spent resting and repairing weapons and siege equipment. Then, on July 11th, the Crusaders marched 2 miles up the Golden Horn to a stone bridge that crossed the water. The emperor had ordered the bridge destroyed, but this was carried out so poorly that it took Latin engineers only a day to rebuild it. Once across the bridge, the Crusaders set up a forward camp just outside the most northwestern part of the city. The Venetians also used this time to their benefit. Robert of Clary left us a great description. Quote, "The Venetians took the diagonal beams from which the sails were hung and lashed enough of them high up on the mast to form a makeshift bridge. These bridges, measuring about 110 feet long, were then covered in planks to form a walkway wide enough for 3 or 4 knights. Handrails and coverings of hide and canvas were then added to protect the attackers against arrows and crossbow bolts. In effect, they had suspended huge leather and wooden tubes high above their ships, from which the bodies of heavily armed knights might be disgorged onto the battlements of Constantinople." End quote. On July 17th, the assault began. Boniface of Montferrat was left to guard the Crusader camp, while Baldwin of Flanders led his men against the wall. The Venetians attacked from the Golden Horn to support the assault. Alexios III had placed his elite Varangian guard to defend against the incoming attack. The fighting became horrendous. The Crusaders would breach the fortifications sporadically, only to meet stiff resistance. The Latin attackers suffered heavy losses and were then driven off. Meanwhile, Doge Dandolo had deployed his fleet along a longer portion of the northern wall. With the bulk of the Byzantine army, including the Varangians, defending the land walls, relatively little was left to defend the sea walls, which were only a single line thick. The Venetian ships unleashed a massive barrage, crossbowmen shooting bolts, archers firing arrows, and men aboard deck launching catapult attacks. In the midst of all this fighting, the Doge sensed his men were not making enough of an impact. He ordered his vermilion galley, the banner of St. Mark fluttering in the wind, to go to the vanguard, then instructed his men to row him ashore at the head of the attack. His men looked on with disbelief but were inspired by the old man's bravado. The Venetians intensified their attack. The defenders, on the other hand, were shocked by the frenzied assault and began to fall back. The fortifications were breached, the Venetians poured in, and in no time, 25 towers were taken. Then the attack spread into the city itself. The struggle became even more desperate. Pisan merchants who lived in the city took up arms to repulse the invaders. Alexios redeployed his Varangian guard at this new threat. The elite soldiers of the emperor plowed into the Venetians and managed to turn the tide. Taking in significant losses, the Venetians pulled back to the wall. In desperation to slow down the Varangian, they set multiple fires in their hasty retreat. The fires began to spread and became a massive conflagration that gutted entire neighborhoods. Historians would later estimate that 120 acres of the city was consumed in the ensuing firestorm. Now, with the Venetians retreating and the Crusaders driven off, Alexios III determined it was time to go on the offensive. The emperor ordered most of his army to march out of the city. A second contingent was left in reserve intended as a later surprise attack. It was at this point that the Crusaders realized just how outnumbered they really were. It was nearly 3-1. Geoffrey of Villehardouin, seeing the numbers before him, was exasperated. He would lament, "You would have thought that the whole world was assembled there." The Venetians abandoned most of their positions along the northern wall to back up their allies, Doge Dandolo declaring that he would live or die alongside his comrades. The Crusaders formed up into a tight and well-disciplined formation, but the staggering army before them led to extreme measures. Stable boys and cooks were pressed into service. They were armed with kitchen implements, cooking pots for helmets, heavy blankets as armor. Meanwhile, Emperor Alexios III brought up even more reinforcements. The backdrop of his impressive city, with menacing, billowing clouds of dark smoke, only added to his alarming presence. Both armies slowly advanced towards one another. Just outside a crossbow range with the small river Lycus between them, both forces paused to size one another up. The Crusader High Command at this point fell into disagreement on what to do next. Meanwhile, the Emperor, it would seem, had them. All that was needed now was the order to attack. But that order never came. Instead, the standoff would continue and wore on well into the day. Then, seemingly out of nowhere and incredibly, Alexios III instructed his troops to withdraw. The puzzled and somewhat confused Venetians and Crusaders looked on as the behemoth imperial army retreated back into the city. Alexios' actions were a disgrace. His people were enraged, and the fact that the fires were still raging only intensified their hatred. His aristocracy approached him and threatened to replace him with his nephew if he didn't act. Grudgingly, he promised to attack the next day. However, that very night, the night of July 17th, 1203, Alexios III collected 1,000 pounds of gold, as much wealth as he could carry, and then around midnight, he abandoned Constantinople to its fate. Nikitas Koniates would say, it was as though he had labored hard to make a miserable corpse of the city, to bring her utter ruin in defiance of her destiny, and by doing so, he had hastened along her destruction. The following morning, news that the great city on the Bosphorus no longer had an emperor shattered its morale. With little recourse, Isaac II was run out of his prison and placed on the throne. Messengers were sent to the young Prince Alexios informing him of this. He would later enter the city along with his Venetian and Crusader allies to take their place next to his father. The prince would be crowned as Emperor Alexios IV. To his credit, he had managed to reclaim his inheritance. Now, however, it was time to repay his debt to those that had helped him. But when the young prince, now emperor, looked into his treasury, he found it was nearly empty. Even though he had become the next emperor, his greatest challenge lay before him. Alexios IV found himself surrounded by a vengeful nobility. His funds were depleted, and he had a completely bloodthirsty army on his doorstep.